Jesus, if he was just a man, his death would not pay for the lives of the billions and billions of people on earth who have sinned. But if Jesus is God, all of a sudden God, well, his bank account's infinite. He can pay for anything, infinitely times over. So whether or not Jesus is God is very important. Now, how can we test whether or not Jesus is God? This is an important question. Don't forget, as a Muslim, this was one of the things that really, really mattered to me. Is Jesus God or not? Because if he is, the Quran is wrong. And I never believed it was possible the Quran could be wrong. So obviously he did not claim to be God. Now, how do we know whether someone is God when they claim to be God? So coming from more of an agnostic position for just a moment, if some man walks into a room and claims to be God, now I went to medical school, I saw people walk into the hospital and claim to be God all the time. This was normal, and I would say to them, well, good for you, we have a room for you. Just come on in, it's padded, it's locked, you'll love it. It's normal for people to claim to be God. Usually they're hallucinating or they're delusional, whatever it is. Now, if one of them says to me, no, Nabeel, listen, I am God, and they're going to kill me. And 3 days after I die, to prove to you what I am saying, I will raise myself from the dead. Now we have something to watch. Now we have something to verify this on. Because if someone dies and rises from the dead, then I'm going to listen to what they have to say, especially if they prophesied that. And if there's anyone I'm going to listen to about the afterlife, it's the person who's been to the afterlife and has come back. Now, where does Jesus say this, by the way? This is in the book of Matthew. People ask Jesus to show him a sign. Now, keep in mind, Jesus has just done an exorcism. He's shown them something miraculous. So when they ask him for a sign, he says, he basically is implying, didn't you just see what I did? But his response to them is, an evil and adulterous generation asks for a sign. I'm not going to give you any sign except for the sign of Jonah. For just as Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights, so shall the Son of Man be in the heart of the earth. In other words, in order to prove to you what I'm saying, you're asking me for a sign, I'll show you one sign. I will be dead and in a grave for 3 days, in Sheol, in the heart of the earth for 3 days. And then I'll come out. Just as Jonah came out of that whale, I will come out from that grave. That's his claim to prove that Christianity is true. And can we see why then the resurrection is so important to the Christian faith? Can we see why then we have to see whether this actually happened? We have to investigate the evidence. It's our duty. As 21st century, historically minded people from the West, we're not people who just generally believe what we're told. We're skeptical about pretty much everything. And so it's our duty, if we're going to believe this, to have a reason for the belief that we have. And in fact, the Bible tells us to have a reason for the hope that lies within us. That's 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. If anyone says to you, we're supposed to believe these things on faith, they have not understood the biblical term faith. The biblical term faith is trust. And basically the type of faith that Christians are called to have is a faith in someone they know. In other words, you're supposed to know God. You're supposed to know what He's done and then have faith. You're supposed to trust that He will stay true to His promises. And to give you a quick example of that with my wife, if she is ever away from me, I trust that she's being loyal to me. Not because I have no evidence, but because I know who she is. I have faith in her because I've seen her, I've known her, I've walked with her, I've seen her loyalty. I have good reason to believe she will stay true to her promises, so I have faith in her. Same with God. We're not just supposed to randomly believe what preachers tell us. We should ask them, what good reason do we have to believe what you're saying? That's why the Bible says, test the spirits. We're not supposed to randomly believe things. When we have good reason to believe in someone, then we have faith in that person because of those good reasons. That's the faith we're called to have. So the Christian faith is based on the fact that we have good reasons to believe the core claims. Jesus died on the cross. He rose from the dead. He claimed to be God. First, let's start with Christianity. What are the sources regarding Christianity? And some of you might be even asking, Nabeel, why should I even believe Jesus is real? Why should I ever even believe that He's a man who existed? The first thing I'm going to start off by telling you is that it is incontrovertible according to the historical principles of investigation that a man named Jesus existed in the first century. How do we know this? We have over 40 records of Jesus' life from ancient times describing this man who is essentially a carpenter in Palestine. He didn't have much of anything. He wasn't a centrally important figure at the time, yet we have 40 sources that refer to him. You know who the emperor was at Jesus' time? Someone shout it out. Tiberius. Good. Tiberius was the emperor of Rome at that time. Now, this is a man who obviously we should have a lot written about. We can expect tons and tons of records about this man, can't we? The historical records contain Tiberius' name by 10 different individuals. That's it. 10 for Tiberius, the emperor of Rome, 40 for Jesus. You can see we have excellent reason to believe that this man, Jesus of Nazareth, lived and existed in the first century. That's why very, very few, in fact, I could probably count it on one hand, actually, I know of two, scholars who study the historical Jesus actually claim that Jesus never existed. And one of them is Bob Price, who most other scholars say is just not even possible what he says. So we can dismiss, just due to the reasoning and due to the lack of scholastic support, that this is actually the case. So Jesus certainly exists. Okay, what can we know about him? Well, of the scholars that study him, and keep in mind, there is an entire area of historical studies called historical Jesus studies. So we have scholars who've been studying this on all sides. These aren't all Christians by any means. Actually, the most influential ones wouldn't align themselves with Orthodox Christianity. You have people like Paula Fredrickson, Marcus Borg, Bart Ehrman. You have people along these lines who would say, like John Dominic Crossan, who would say that of Jesus we can know for a fact that he died on the cross. Now keep in mind, that's one of our 3 points that we're proving for Christianity or attempting to show to determine its reliability. Did Jesus die on the cross? The scholars who study his life, regardless of whether they're atheist, Buddhist, agnostic, Hindu, Christian, it doesn't matter. They all conclude that Jesus died on the cross. Now, if I left it there, it would be an appeal to authority, and we're trying to be academically rigorous tonight, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to give you some of their reasons why they believe Jesus died on the cross, but we're going to keep it brief because scholars are unanimous on this issue. By the way, it's not just them. Even Muslim scholars will argue that Jesus did die on the cross. How many of you heard of Reza Aslan's book recently, Zealots, that came out this year? A few of you? Reza Aslan's a scholar who has studied the historical Jesus. And as a Muslim, he says, yes, Islam denies Jesus' death on the cross, and I am a Muslim, but I confirm that Jesus' death on the cross is historically certain. In fact, he builds his whole book off the fact that Jesus died on the cross. So even as a Muslim, he says Jesus died on the cross. So why? Why do they say this? Well, because first off, all the evidence that we have, all the records of Jesus' life, which talk about his death, indicate that he did die. If they say anything, it says that he did die on the cross under Pontius Pilate, which is why Paula Fredrickson says, if there's anything we can know about Jesus, anything at all, it's this, that he died on the cross under Pontius Pilate. If you go away from Christian records, you go to Jewish records like Josephus, we can also see in the first century that non-Christians are saying Jesus died on the cross. We go to Gentile scholars, they are also agreeing that Jesus died on the cross. And in fact, we also have some of them saying that these people believe he is risen from the dead. We'll get to that in just a moment. So we have excellent reason to believe Jesus died on the cross because all the records point to that. Plus, if you study the historical process of crucifixion, nobody ever in the entire history of the Roman process of crucifixion, no one ever survived a full Roman crucifixion. Oh, they were crucifying people by the hundreds, especially when it came time around Jesus' time, all the way till the fall of the temple. They were crucifying people by the hundreds to make a point. That if you rebel against the Romans, we will humiliate you, we will torture you, and we will destroy you and your people. And that's exactly what was happening to all the Jews who were amongst this rebellion that happened in the late 60s, beginning of the 70s, in the first century AD. Not a single one of them survived the process of crucifixion. Why? Well, first there's a flogging process. And this flogging isn't light. It's not like caning. The flogging process went with a Roman flagrum. Now, if you understand what a flagrum is, it's a whip that has 6 leather cords that come off of it. And each of those leather cords has leather balls at the end with shards of bone and metal dumbbells. As a person would be whipped, this whip was designed to cause extreme vasodilation on the skin. You have those metal dumbbells there for that reason, to bring the blood vessels, to bring lots of blood to the fore, to bring pain receptors to the surface. And then those bones, those shards of bones would latch into the skin and rip it off. So you would bleed more blood than you otherwise would. That's how this whip was designed. Oh, this whole process of crucifixion was designed to be as painful, as torturous as possible. Cicero, I believe it was Cicero, who said that let no Roman citizen even think or hear the word crucifixion. and Roman citizens were not allowed to be crucified. This was reserved for the most treacherous criminals. Not a common criminal, the worst criminal. It was also said that arteries and veins were laid bare during the process of the of the flogging. That people's intestines often fell out because their abdominal wall was ripped open. This was horrific, and people often died during the flogging process. It's called the pre-death for that very reason. And in the case of Jesus, we know that something happened. According to the Gospel of John, Jesus was flogged more than normal because Pilate wanted to bring Jesus back in front of the crowd and say, look, we've flogged him. Do you still want to crucify him? We've punished him. And they say, no, crucify him. It would stand to reason that he flogged him more than they thought they would in order for him to say, okay, let's go ahead and release him. But they said, no, let's crucify him. Let's move on for just a moment. This process of flogging would often leave someone devoid of skin. Their skin would be falling off in ribbons. As they're carrying the cross, they're not carrying it with a loincloth on, with skin on their body. No, their skin's hanging off in tatters. And they're naked, made to parade through a group of people. And once they're finally nailed on the cross, they're nailed through the interosseous space here between the radius and the ulna. It's because that is where the force of the weight could be held. If someone was nailed through the hands would just rip and someone would die that way. The reason why it says hands in some places is because in those times they referred to this whole area as hands. They're nailed through here, right through the median nerve, the major sensory motor nerve of the hand. If you are nailed through that place, you immediately lose all use and sensation of your hand. Then you're nailed through your feet. A 7-inch nail goes through both your feet. Why? Because if someone were just to hang on the cross, they would have no way to breathe out. As they sink back down, they'd breathe in and they'd have to push to breathe out. Well, what are they going to push against? A nail through their feet. It's to prolong the torture. It's to prolong the death. And when they finally wanted to kill you, they'd break your knees so that you couldn't push up anymore and you'd asphyxiate and die. Or they would stick a spear through your heart. That was a way to be sure that you'd be dead. Or they'd crush your skull with a hammer. Or they'd light your body on fire. Or they'd take your body and feed you to dogs. They were going to make absolutely sure that you died. That was the whole point. And no one in all of Roman history survived a full crucifixion. So we have excellent reason to believe Jesus died on the cross. Did he rise from the dead? This is an important matter. And lots of historians say we cannot investigate the resurrection because that's not a historical matter. That's a supernatural matter. And you can't study supernatural matters. Well, that's jumping the gun just a bit. If every explanation that is naturalistic falls short and falls very short of explaining what happened, then we have reason to believe that something supernatural may have happened. If there simply is no good explanation, naturalistically speaking, we can use the historical process of investigation to conclude that quite likely maybe something supernatural happened here. So what happened when Jesus died? Shortly after his death, we take a look at what happened, and those historical scholars we've already referred to, in general, agree with 3 facts that are considered relatively incontrovertible. And I'm giving you what's called the minimal facts argument, if you want to look into this. It's called the minimal facts argument, primarily promoted by a man named Gary Habermas, who's written a book called The Historical Jesus. Also by his protege, Michael Licona, who's written a book called The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. He wrote it alongside Gary Habermas. And he's also written his manifesto, a rather large book that serves well for curing insomnia. He's written that as well. Sorry, Mike. He's written that as well. And if you want to look at a very thorough investigation of the historical method on whether or not Jesus died, I suggest you take a look at this book published by Erdman's. Michael Licona is the author. The argument runs as follows. Pretty much every scholar who studies this, at least a vast majority, if not virtually all scholars, conclude 3 things happened after Jesus died. Well, number 1, the first one is that Jesus did die on the cross, which we just looked at. Number 2, that the disciples, Jesus' disciples, all believed he had risen from the dead. Now get me right here. That doesn't mean he did just because they believed it, but it means they did sincerely believe it. They went to their death believing Jesus died and rose and appeared to them. So it's that belief that we're holding on to. Not necessarily that he did, but they sincerely believed he had risen from the dead. And why do they conclude that, by the way? All the disciples ran away from Jesus when he was arrested. They were fearful. They didn't know what was going on. Even Thomas, who was willing to go to his death for Jesus, when Jesus was arrested, they all ran away. Of course, we know John watched the crucifixion, and we do know that Peter came to the trial scene, but at least at that time, they all ran away. However, after the resurrection, these men were willing to go to their deaths proclaiming that Jesus had risen from the dead. These men were willing to die for the fact that this man had risen. Again, that doesn't mean he had actually risen, that we're not there yet. But it does mean they sincerely believed it, because liars make poor martyrs. People aren't going to die for a lie or something that they know is false. Of course, people die for things that are false all the time, but not things that they know are false. So, the disciples truly believed that Jesus had risen from the dead, and according to most historical Jesus scholarship, Christianity wouldn't have gotten off the ground if it weren't for that fact. Fact number 3. Fact number 1 was Jesus died on the cross. Fact number 2, the disciples truly believed he had risen from the dead. Fact number 3, people who were enemies of Jesus, or not his disciples, also believed about 2 people, James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul, or Saul of Tarsus, as it were. James, the brother of Jesus, did not follow Jesus during his lifetime. We see in the book of Mark that Jesus' family comes up and says to people around Jesus that he is out of his mind, basically, that he's crazy, which is what leads Jesus to say, "Who is my mother and brother and sister?" It's those who do the will of God. So Jesus' family is not on his side. It wasn't until after the resurrection, or supposedly the resurrection, when all of a sudden the disciple James the brother of Jesus, James, becomes a leader of the Christian church. And also Saul of Tarsus. Who is this Saul guy? Saul was the student of Gamaliel, one of the chief leaders of the Jews in the time. This man was primed and groomed to be a leader of Jews, a leader of Pharisees. He was going to have all kinds of power in the temple. He already had all kinds of power because he was able to deliver people to prison. He was given special permission to hunt Christians down. Yet this man was willing to go to his death over and over and over again. For something. For what? He claims it was because he has seen the risen Jesus. Now, let's stop and think for just a second. We've got these 3 facts that, again, virtually every scholar agrees with who studies the historical Jesus. How do we account for these 3 facts? Well, let's put the resurrection aside for a bit. What is the most common alternative hypothesis for the resurrection of Jesus? Number 1, it's that the disciples hallucinated Jesus. They hallucinated his return. And the argument goes as follows. People who have followed a man like Jesus, their spiritual leader, for years and years and years, they've grown to love him. Of course we can expect them to see the risen Jesus after he dies. They hallucinated him. They loved him so much he returned to them, at least in their eyes. And we know that people today, and this part is true, we know that people today often see their loved ones after they died. That must have happened with Jesus' disciples. They saw Jesus after he died. Okay, let's take a look at that hypothesis for just a minute. The earliest records of Jesus' resurrection say that 500 people saw him risen at the same time. Now, what am I talking about? I'm going to explain this briefly because I want you to have the evidence before you so you know what we're talking about. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 8. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 8. Yes, they're written by Paul, and Paul wrote 1 Corinthians probably towards the end of the 40s AD or the beginning of the 50s AD. But here's what a group of, when I say non-Christian, I mean non-Orthodox Christian scholars have claimed. This is the Jesus Seminar. Many of these people call themselves atheists and agnostics. None of them is really a friend to traditional Christianity. Here's what they argue. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 8. Comes from a formulation that arose 2 to 5 years after Jesus' death. 2 to 5 years after Jesus' death. Stop and think for just a moment. What from all of history comes that quickly? The first biography of Alexander the Great that we consider substantial comes 300 to 400 years after Alexander died. 300 to 400 years after Alexander died. This is 2 to 5 years after Jesus' death? Nothing in history comes that fast. In fact, one scholar who's even more respected than many of the Jesus Seminar scholars, is a man by the name of James D.G. Dunn. And in his book, Jesus Remembered, James D.G. Dunn is a professor emeritus out of Durham University in the UK. In his book, Jesus Remembered, he says that this formulation came within months after Jesus' death. So he dies at the Passover before the end of the year. People have already formulated the fact that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to Peter and James and the 12, and then to the 500. All of that is formulated within months after Jesus' death. This is history at its finest, even according to the Jesus Seminar, non-Christian scholars. So you have the fact that 500 people saw Jesus risen at the same time. Can we really have a mass hallucination? That's like inventing a miracle to avoid a miracle. There is no such thing as a mass hallucination. So this theory that the hallucination theory is a good one, it just doesn't fit the facts. But the fact it really doesn't fit is that third fact. Why in the world would Paul have hallucinated the return of Jesus? He had no psychological phenomenon that would explain this. He hadn't followed Jesus for 3 years. He hadn't given his life to Jesus, as it were. Yet even Paul is willing to go to his death because Jesus is risen. So, this theory simply does not fit the three facts that pretty much all scholars will grant. What's the next most common theory? The next most common theory, instead of the resurrection, is that Jesus' body was stolen by the disciples. Well, again, that doesn't explain why Paul saw the risen Jesus. And it doesn't explain why the disciples would have gone to their death proclaiming the risen Jesus. They don't die for a lie. They honestly believe this. So the theory that fits the facts the best, and after that, by the way, you start getting to some other theories, like Jesus had a twin that no one knew about who came right at that time. Then we get to the super alien theory. I mean, it gets really fanciful after that. So none of the arguments explains the facts as well as the resurrection. So what is the claim that I'm making? Is it historically certain that Jesus rose from the dead? That's not the claim I'm making. The claim I'm making is that Jesus' resurrection is historically the most responsible claim. It is by far the one that fits the facts the best. That's my claim. So number one, we've looked at Jesus' death on the cross. Number two, we've looked at the fact that it's reasonable to believe, and far the most reasonable thing, to believe that he rose from the dead. What about number three? This was the one that mattered to me most as a Muslim. Did Jesus claim to be God or not? Well, the first thing we have to look at are what are the reliable sources regarding Jesus' life? What sources do we have that we can look at which are relatively reliable? I'm going to quote a scholar for you. This is one that a lot of my Muslim friends enjoy quoting. His name is Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman was my professor when I studied at UNC, and he is well known as someone who challenges the traditional Christian claims. Bart Ehrman has said that if you want to study the historical Jesus, you have to go to the 4 canonical Gospels. You have to. There's nowhere else to turn that comes remotely close. Why does he say that? Because the 4 canonical Gospels are the earliest records of Jesus' life. It'd be like going to, taking an interview. If there was a traffic accident and you go to talk to people who were at the scene of the accident immediately, right after the accident happened. What happened? Tell me what happened. Who hit who was driving, what was going on, give me the details. Or waiting 4 months, calling those very same people in and saying, what happened 4 months ago at that traffic accident? Who hit who? Tell me what happened. Of course, the more reliable stories are the ones that are taken immediately. The earliest ones are better. We all know this. And there is no gospel that comes anywhere close, or no account of Jesus' life that comes anywhere close to the historical proximity as the 4 Gospels. We can talk about the dating of the Gospels if you'd like during the Q&A session. I'm going to give you the critical datings of the Gospel. I'm not going to give you the Christian datings. I'm going to give you the critical datings of the Gospels. Mark's Gospel comes first, approximately 70 AD. Matthew and Luke come next, approximately 80 to 90. 80, 85 is Matthew, 85 to 90 is Luke. And then John's Gospel comes last, 90 to 100 AD. Now, hear me. I don't agree with these dates. I think that they're very tenuous. I don't think we can actually defend them, but critical scholars use those dates, so I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and go with those dates. If we go with Mark's Gospel being written at 70 AD, that is just 40 years away from Jesus, 4 decades. Still in the lifetime of many people who were alive at Jesus' time. Jesus If people were 20 years old while Jesus was around, they're 60 by the time Mark's gospel is around. And we know people lived to a ripe old age at that time. Yes, many died early, but many also lived to a ripe old age. We know Polycarp, for example, who was contemporary to that time, lived into his hundreds, or was it 90s? He lived till he was very old. And John the elder lived till he was very old, died in Turkey. So we have people who are alive at this time. Well, what did they say? Now, generally speaking, when we turn to the four Gospels, historical Jesus scholars are going to leave out John's Gospel. They're going to say, we're not going to look at John's Gospel. And why is that? Because it's the last of the four, and it looks different from the other four. It looks fairly different, and I'll agree to that. So historical Jesus scholars don't generally look at John's Gospel. Now, I think that's a mistake. There's only one place in Mark's Gospel where Jesus says clearly who he is. Now, up until then, he's been using a title for himself quite regularly. What is that title? Son of Man. Over 80 times in the Gospels, Jesus uses the term Son of Man. The first time it's found is in Mark chapter 2, verse 10. The next time it's found is in Mark chapter 2, verse 24. Throughout Mark's Gospel, Son of Man is the one where Jesus uses the title to refer to himself frequently. Now, there are two sons of men in the Old Testament. One found in Ezekiel and one found in the book of Daniel. Okay, these are two very different sons of men. The Son of Man in the book of Ezekiel is a lowly human figure. God refers to Ezekiel in the vocative every time, calling him the Son of Man. Son of Man do this, Son of Man do that. And it's to emphasize how human Ezekiel is. But then there's a Son of Man in the book of Daniel, which looks very, very different. This is a Son of Man who comes on the clouds of heaven. What does that mean? The only being that comes on the clouds of heaven in the Old Testament is a divine being. In fact, God comes on the clouds of heaven in the Old Testament. So here in the book of Daniel, chapter 7, verse 13, you have one who looks like a Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. A very different Son of Man. Which one is Jesus claiming to be? Well, like I said, there's one place in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus boldly, loudly, publicly, clearly proclaims who he is. And that's Mark chapter 14, verse 62. In Mark chapter 14, verse 62, Jesus has been asked by the high priest, who is he? Who is he? Up until this point, he hasn't been saying. This is known as the climax of Mark's gospel. This is what everything has been building to. This question, Jesus, who are you? And Jesus responds, the question is, who are you? Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? Jesus responds, I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven. You will see the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. So which Son of Man is Jesus referring to? I can hear you. Daniel. He's referring to the one in Daniel, the Son of Man who comes to the clouds of heaven. That's the one he's been talking about.